In Leeds, Jim Hobson's new team of policemen has now taken over the Ripper inquiry. And already they claim to have had a pile of new information from the public. But they warn women who've been going out armed with knives and sharpened steel combs that they do risk arrest for carrying offensive weapons. Tonight, one hospital in Leeds is on red alert after telephone threats that one of the nurses there would be the Ripper's 14th victim. The deep sense of fear and resentment that has built up in this Yorkshire community after 5 years of fruitless police inquiries into these brutal murders is hard to convey.
Sutcliffe's last victim was a 19-year-old student at Leeds University, Jacqueline Hill. Her death led to the setting up of a new super squad of top detectives, desperate to catch a man who seemed to defy every known detection technique. In fact, Sutcliffe had been amazingly lucky. Perhaps the strongest clue he left behind was the new £5 note he'd given to a prostitute he'd killed in Manchester. The number was traced to an engineering firm he worked for in Bradford, and he was interviewed there 6 times by the police.
They thought they'd got him. I mean, one lad said to me, he said, well, you know, we think this is him, and took him away. Peter came back about 5 o'clock, and because we asked him what happened, they said that they'd interviewed him further, questioned him of his whereabouts and what he did, and they took some of his clothes away for forensic tests, and they gave him a saliva test as well. It used to be a joke that he was nicknamed the Ripper, and he used to answer to that sometimes. So it was, it's rather sort of. It's sad now, isn't it?
Sutcliffe murdered 13 women across Yorkshire and the northwest of England between 1975 and 1980. He was also convicted of the attempted murder of 7 other women. This report from our correspondent Danny Savage contains some flashing images.
Over a period of 6 years, all of these women were murdered by the same man. 13 families' lives torn apart by Peter Sutcliffe.
Last year, Jimmy Savile's coffin was driven past Leeds General Hospital, where he'd worked as a volunteer porter. Hospital staff joined the crowds, saying their goodbyes and applauding him. How things have changed.
Now then.
Each day brings new shocking allegations, the latest suggesting he used his charity work to gain access to the young and the vulnerable. 40 years ago, June Thornton was a patient at Leeds General Infirmary. She says she saw the TV and radio star molest a brain-damaged girl, a memory that has haunted her.
The Metropolitan Police say that it will now take the lead in investigating sex abuse allegations against the late Sir Jimmy Savile as more women come forward claiming to have been assaulted by the television presenter.
Who's your best pal?
You as a pal, get off my backside.
Hey? I beg your pardon? In front of your mummy and daddy? Goodness gracious.
Savile used his celebrity, his volunteering and fundraising roles to gain unprecedented access to NHS hospitals. His access within NHS hospitals gave Savile the opportunity to commit sexual abuses on a grand scale for nearly 50 years.
I mean, to me, I probably think of him much as you do now, but I also remember him as he was, which was a completely foreign to what he eventually became and what he is now. I always say, when people start talking about the ones he killed and the ones he didn't kill, because I know, and the police know, that he didn't do all the murders that he was convicted for. They got him to admit to them, to clear their books. Peter had been persuaded to admit to everything that they put in front of him.
Well,
now I know he didn't do them all. He told us that when we went to see him. He says, I didn't do them all.
Savile's status and influence in Leeds General Infirmary, Stoke Mandeville and Broadmoor hospitals was enhanced by the endorsement and encouragement he received from politicians, senior civil servants and NHS managers.
But here's the thing. Savile wasn't just a visitor here. Incredibly, for a time, he was in charge. In 1988, Health Minister Edwina Curry appointed Savile to head up a task force to run the place. At the time, Marjorie was working with some patients in the hospital. She remembers asking officials at the Department of Health why.
I was told, look, this is quite a coup. We're trying to change the culture here.
Why do you think concerns that may have been raised fell on such deaf ears time and time again?
I think it's because that would have spoiled what they hoped was happening, which was that things were opening up.
Here's how Savile described his new job at the time.
We are a great listening hospital. We listen to people. I listen to nurses. I listen to doctors. I listen to porters. I listen to drivers. I listen to everybody. We've turned into a great listening hospital.
Broadmoor needed a shake-up at the time. It was in the throes of an industrial dispute, and officials thought Savile could fix it. He was given access to all areas. He had so much power, he could overrule senior nurses.
Every suspect put forward was taken seriously, and I didn't interview Savile. I can't recall who did, but certainly it was mentioned that he had been put forward as a suspect, and I forget now how it came to our attention. I think it was an anonymous source, but knowing what is known now, the person putting forward Savile was aiming in the right direction. It came to my attention that he'd been put forward as a suspect. I believe he was living in the Bellevue area then, Bellevue Road area with his mother, in a flat up there, I think, but it's over 30 years ago.
So he was dismissed at the time? I mean,
he was interviewed and eliminated. I don't know how he was eliminated. I took no part in that aspect of the inquiry.
Good evening. Tonight, a highly critical report says police forces failed for almost 50 years to act on abuse allegations made against the TV presenter Jimmy Savile.
It also reveals West Yorkshire Police were sent a letter by the Metropolitan Police 15 years ago suggesting Savile was a paedophile, but it was never followed up. And despite the fact he lived in Leeds, the force said it had no intelligence reports on him. Since his death, it's emerged 40 of his victims were from West Yorkshire. Kathy Killick reports.
He's now known to have been Britain's most prolific sex offender, abusing at least 450 people. But the police never brought Jimmy Savile to book. Today's report by Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary asks why, and lists numerous failings by officers and systems over the decades. But as his home police force, it's West Yorkshire Police that still has the most questions to answer. We now know 40 people were abused by Savile in West Yorkshire, but the police had no records of any complaints at all against him.
It was the close relationship between a personality and a police force. Jimmy Savile lived within the West Yorkshire Police area for most of his life and committed many of his crimes there. Now a report by the force has examined whether his celebrity status meant detectives shielded him from arrest or prosecution. Overall, it concludes there's no evidence he was given special protection. The review reveals Savile has now been accused of 76 crimes in the West Yorkshire area, involving 68 victims. The offences include rape, sexual assault and indecent exposure. 18 of his victims were under the age of 13. The youngest was 5 years old. Over the years, Savile often boasted that he'd entertained several senior police officers at his flat inside this building here. He called it his Friday morning club. Today's review confirms that over 2 decades, up to 8 different police officers did come here. But there's no evidence, it says, that any of them acted improperly.
A former West Yorkshire police inspector is being investigated by the Independent Police Complaints Commission after claims he intervened on behalf of Jimmy Savile before the TV personality was interviewed by officers investigating allegations of sexual abuse. The transcript of the 2009 police interview with Savile showed him joking with officers as he denied any wrongdoing. Well, our reporter Porrick O'Brien is with me now. Porrick.
Well, Chris, we've known for some time that Savile had a relationship with officers from West Yorkshire Police. We knew, for example, that some of them were regulars at his Friday morning breakfast club, his inner circle, basically, that would meet every Friday morning in his flat in Leeds. But bit by bit, we're getting more insight into the mechanics, if you like, of that relationship. So, for example, 4 years ago, Surrey Police were about to conduct an interview with Savile to question him over allegations of sexual abuse. We've learnt that ahead of that interview, an officer from West Yorkshire Police that was named today as Mick Starkey called Surrey ahead of the interview and spoke to them on Savile's behalf. Now, yesterday we reported on transcripts that were released of that interview that happened between Savile and Surrey. And in one excerpt, Savile explains what he does with what he describes as weirdo letters, letters that would have included letters from women that would have made allegations against him. He says he passes them on to a handful of officers at West Yorkshire Police. Some of the names in the interview are redacted, but it demonstrates how close Savile was to some members of West Yorkshire Police.
From Marcella Claxton. 4 months after the second murder, Marcella Claxton came out of a party in Leeds and got into a car with a stranger. She thought he was taking her home. Instead, he brought her here to Roundhay Park and attacked her with a hammer. But the police never included Marcella Claxton in the Ripper case. They discounted her photo fit because she wasn't a prostitute and hadn't been attacked with a knife. But 9 months later, her bearded attacker went back to Roundhay Park with another woman in his car. This time, he took her behind the sports pavilion. This time, he left clearly identifiable tire marks, and this time, he killed her. Her name was Irene Richardson. She was 28, recently separated from her husband and 3 children. She'd been hit on the head 3 times with a hammer, stabbed brutally in the stomach, neck and throat. Police uncovered a macabre new twist. The killer had arranged his victim's body, unzipped her knee-length boots and laid them carefully, neatly, over the back of her thighs.
These were not frenzied attacks. This was the sort of man who thought about what he had done, planned his attack carefully, and then was concerned to arrange everything about the body to have the maximum shock impact upon whoever came upon the scene first and those who came afterwards.
Here's whose house it is.
Yeah, I mean, this is a man who was a great manipulator. He'd created an environment around him which gave him access to every element of society, from the royal family to a number of prime ministers to every charity. And indeed, we know his access to schools, to hospitals. He was very specific in who he chose as far as his victims go. But as Weena says, this was a man who put himself in a situation where he gained an amount of trust. And the problem is people didn't challenge him on that. And to a degree, we've seen that now with regards to the police and the way the CPS looked at this, is that this was a man who was effectively believed in what he said. We now know he was a predatory paedophile who was abusing children over 60 years.